The explosion rocked the ship with the fury of 1,000 suns. Metal groaned, and the air was thick with smoke as the Royal Star Cruiser of the Trillion Empire was torn apart in a blaze of fire. Princess Elisura, heir to the most feared empire in the galaxy, was thrown violently from her seat as the ship's hull buckled under the force of the assault. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the stars flickering outside her window as the once proud vessel plummeted toward an uncharted planet. Her consciousness fluttered in and out, like the wings of a dying moth. Blood stained her hands and clothing, but it was the burning agony in her chest that left her paralyzed. Elisara's mind clung to fragments of a life before the chaos, a life of privilege, power, and duty. She had been destined to rule, to lead her people to glory. Now, she was just another casualty in a galactic war that had spanned centuries. The thought was almost unbearable. How could she, the Princess of Trillia, the symbol of her people's strength, be reduced to this? Her vision cleared, but the world around her was a hazy blur. The ground beneath her felt unnaturally soft, the air cool and damp. It was strange, foreign. Where was she? The Trillion warship should have crashed on a battleground, not in some remote wilderness. She's alive. The voice was a soft whisper at first, but it echoed in Elisara's mind like thunder. She tried to move, but pain shot through her body like a spear, stopping her in her tracks. Her breath was shallow, ragged. She needed help. Her eyes focused, and through the haze, she saw a figure approaching, a human medic, judging by the way he moved, confident yet cautious. His uniform, covered in dirt and patches from a dozen different species, marked him as part of the human expeditionary force. The very same humans who were the Trillion Empire's greatest enemies. She tried to recoil, but her limbs wouldn't obey. "Don't try to move. You're in no condition to fight," the human said gently, kneeling beside her. His face was calm, but there was something about his eyes, something almost kind. Elisara's pride flared. No human should speak to her in such a manner. She was royalty. She was untouchable. Yet, in her state, she was nothing. Powerless. Helpless. "Who are you?" she managed to rasp, her voice barely audible. The man's lips quirked into a faint, grim smile. "I'm Dr. Elias Rivers, a medic. And you, Princess Elisara, are in need of immediate attention." The words hit her like a blow. He knew who she was, her title, her status. Yet there was no fear in his eyes, no trembling respect, as her people always showed when in her presence. Instead, he seemed concerned. For her. Elisara swallowed, her mind racing. She couldn't allow this human to treat her. She couldn't allow herself to rely on him, on someone so beneath her. The Trillion Empire's enemies were known for their weakness, and humans were no different. But her body betrayed her. Her pulse raced, and every breath felt like a jagged edge in her chest. She knew deep down that without help, she wouldn't survive. And the Empire needed her. She was more than a mere princess. She was the key to ending the war. If she died here, in some nameless corner of the galaxy, it would be a victory for the enemy. Dr. Rivers must have read the conflict in her eyes, because he didn't wait for her consent. His gloved hands gently lifted her bloodied arm, moving with practiced precision as he examined the damage. "You've lost a lot of blood. Your rib cage is crushed on the left side. I'll need to stabilize you before I can do anything else," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. Elisara bit back a scream as he pressed a device against her side. His touch was cool, clinical, but there was no malice in it, only a calm focus. She couldn't deny the relief that washed over her as the sharp pain eased, replaced by the quiet hum of medical technology at work. Yet, a bitter anger simmered in her chest. She hated how vulnerable she was. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "You're my enemy." Dr. Rivers paused for a moment, then looked her directly in the eyes. His expression softened, and his voice, though quiet, carried a weight she hadn't expected. "Because right now, you're a person in need of saving. And that's all that matters." Elisara's heart skipped a beat. She stared at him, caught off guard by his words. No one," had ever spoken to her like that. She had always been the princess, the ruler, the one who commanded respect. But this human, this stranger, was treating her like an equal. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. The sound of distant footsteps broke the moment. Someone or something was coming. And they were not alone. Elisara's pulse quickened again, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from the realization that her fate was no longer in her hands alone. Elisara had never felt so vulnerable in her life. The once feared princess of the Trillion Empire, who commanded legions and instilled terror across the galaxy, now lay in the hands of a human medic, a species her people had been at war with for decades. The irony stung her more than the pain in her ribs. She had never imagined that she would be saved by one of them, let alone have her survival depend on their mercy. But there she was, drifting in and out of consciousness, with Dr. Elias Rivers working tirelessly to patch up the damage the crash had inflicted on her body. Her pride wanted to reject his help, to demand that he leave her to die with dignity, as was the way of her people. But the quiet, steady pressure of his hands on her fractured body was undeniable. She couldn't stop him, even if she wanted to. It was almost as if her survival had already been decided by forces beyond her control. And she hated it. For hours, Dr. Rivers never left her side, his cool, steady voice reassuring her whenever she stirred. At first, Elisara couldn't comprehend why he wasn't simply taking her captive, or better yet, leaving her to die. Anything but this unwanted, invasive care. But as time wore on, something shifted. She noticed how carefully he adjusted the various instruments he used to treat her injuries, how he always spoke to her like a fellow sentient being, rather than an enemy. It was infuriating. "You're doing well," Dr. Rivers said softly, adjusting the drip feeding into her arm. "Your blood pressure's stabilizing. I think you'll make it through the worst of it." Elisara wanted to snap at him, to remind him who she was. She was not some wounded creature to be pitied. But instead, she just closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take over. She hated that his words felt like truth, even though every instinct told her to distrust him. The hours stretched into days as Dr. Rivers continued his care. She could no longer deny that her condition was improving. Pain lessened. Her breath became easier, and even her strength started to return. But each improvement came with a bitter taste in her mouth. How could she allow a human to save her? In the quiet moments when Dr. Rivers wasn't around, Elisara often found herself staring at the stars through the wreckage of her ship. Her thoughts wandered to her people, her empire, waiting for her to return to lead them. They couldn't afford to lose their princess, not now, not when the war was on the verge of tipping in their favor. But Elisara wasn't sure she could return to her people as she was. "You're awake," Dr. Rivers' voice broke through her thoughts, his tone soft and unassuming as he sat beside her. He had clearly been waiting for her to stir. Elisara met his gaze, trying to hold on to her pride, to the belief that she could remain aloof from this strange connection they were forming. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice rough, "about why you're helping me." He didn't immediately respond, but his steady gaze never left her. "You asked that already," he said quietly, "and I gave you the answer, because you needed help. Right now, that's all that matters." Elisara's eyes narrowed. His calmness unnerved her, especially since it contrasted so sharply with the way her own people would have reacted in a similar situation. "You humans are strange," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Your compassion is your greatest strength, and your greatest weakness." Dr. Rivers chuckled, but there was no mockery in his laugh, only a quiet understanding. "Maybe. But that's what makes us different, I suppose." Elisara frowned, not entirely understanding what he meant. Her people saw compassion as a weakness, a flaw to be exploited by their enemies. In the galaxy of war, only the strong survived. But here was a human, sitting beside her, treating her with respect, even though she was an enemy. How could he not despise her, like every other Trillion did? How could he offer her kindness? She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. Was it really worth it? She had been trained to fight, to lead, to win, and yet, here she was helpless, needing to rely on someone who, just days ago, would have been her enemy. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Rivers asked gently, sensing the change in her mood. Elisara hesitated. She wasn't used to being open with anyone, let alone a human. But in that moment, something about his sincerity made her voice falter. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You could just leave me here, let me die. Why bother?" Dr. Rivers' expression softened, and for the first time since they had met, Elisara saw a flicker of something more in his eyes, something that transcended the healer-patient dynamic. "Because no one deserves to die alone," he said simply. The words lingered in the air, and Elisara was struck speechless. She had heard many things in her life, but never something like that. For the first time, she realized that her survival, this tenuous alliance, might not be as simple as her victory or his mercy. Perhaps there was something more here, something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. And for the first time since the crash, Elisara felt a flicker of hope. The enemy ships were closing in. Elisara's heart pounded against her ribs, her body still weak from the crash and the brutal medical treatments she had endured. But the sound of approaching engines, cold, mechanical, relentless, was the sharpest reminder that she was no longer the princess of a mighty empire. She was a prisoner, a fragile survivor, stranded on a planet that wasn't even supposed to exist on the trillion star maps. As Dr. Rivers checked the crude makeshift shelter they had set up, Elisara stood at the entrance, her eyes scanning the distant horizon. She could already see the shimmer of enemy craft in the sky, the unmistakable gleam of trillion warships. It was only a matter of time before they descended upon her location. And when they did, she knew what would happen. She would be taken back to her people, her betrayal exposed. Her empire would demand an explanation for her abandonment, and in the end, she would be forced to choose between her loyalty to her people and the strange, inexplicable bond she had formed with Dr. Rivers. "How long until they reach us?" Elisara asked, her voice calm but her thoughts racing. Dr. Rivers didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the makeshift medical equipment he'd cobbled together from the wreckage of her ship, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air around them hummed with the tension of their shared situation, but he finally spoke, his voice steady. "They'll be here in less than an hour. We don't have much time." Elisara's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to escape, to return to the Trillion Empire and resume her place as their heir. Her people were waiting for her. Her empire was on the brink of victory. The war with humanity could be ended with one simple command, and she would be the one to deliver it. But then there was Dr. Rivers, the human who had saved her life, who had treated her not as an enemy, but as someone worth saving. She had seen enough of humanity's brutality in the wars she'd fought, but this one was different. He didn't want to conquer her, didn't want to kill her. He simply wanted her to live. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of the ceremonial blade strapped to her side, a relic from her royal heritage. She had been taught to wield it with the strength of an entire empire. Yet now, the weight of that blade felt like a mockery of everything she was becoming. "You're quiet," Dr. Rivers said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "What's going on in your head?" Elisara turned to face him, her gaze sharp. "My people are coming. I have to return to them, or everything we've fought for will be lost." He didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged, but the sincerity in his eyes cut through her like nothing else. "What about what you fought for here?" he asked. "What about your life?" She swallowed, her chest tightening. "I can't choose between my people and what you want. I'm the princess of Trilia. I can't abandon my duty." "Your duty?" he repeated, his voice growing soft but firm. "What does that really mean? To follow orders from people who've never cared about you, or to live for yourself?" The question hit her harder than any blow from a weapon. For a moment, she couldn't answer. The very foundation of her identity, the purpose that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember, seemed to crumble before her. What was duty when it led to nothing but endless bloodshed? What was loyalty when it cost her everything? The sound of the enemy ships grew louder, closer. Dr. Rivers. Elisara's voice faltered. What should I do? He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. You have to decide, Elisara. You can't keep running from it. Loyalty to your people or loyalty to yourself? She stared at him, the question hanging between them, suspended in the air like a razor's edge. She knew what the answer should be. She knew what was expected of her. But as she looked at him, this human who had given her a chance to live, who had shown her kindness in a world where that was rare, Elisara knew something else was pulling at her heart. For the first time, the weight of her title felt unbearable. Her decision was about to reshape everything, and the cost would be higher than she could ever imagine. The sound of approaching boots echoed in the distance. A signal that time had run out. Elisara's heart quickened as the air around her seemed to grow thicker, as if the very planet was closing in on her. She glanced at Dr. Rivers, who was packing away the few supplies they had salvaged from a wreckage, his hands working quickly but without haste. His calm demeanor only heightened her sense of urgency. They'll be here soon, she said, voice strained. Dr. Rivers didn't look up. We'll need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the harder it'll be to escape. Elisara's gaze drifted to the nearby ridge, where the first flickers of enemy ships began to break through the clouds, dark and ominous against the sky. The Trillian military was relentless. They would search every inch of this planet until they found her. And when they did, there would be no more medical aid, no more hope. She would be dragged back to the Empire, her future decided by the whims of an unforgiving court. I can't go back, Elisara whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. Dr. Rivers paused, his back still to her. You don't have to, he said simply. But his voice lacked conviction, the unspoken understanding that no matter what she chose, she was trapped in a web of politics, power, and survival. Where else can I go? Elisara said bitterly. I have no allies here, no sanctuary. The Trillian Empire is my birthright. If I abandon it, I am nothing. Dr. Rivers finally turned, meeting her gaze with a steady, unyielding look. You are someone, Elisara. More than your title, more than the empire that claims you. You have a choice. Her breath caught in her throat. His words were true, but they stung all the same. She had spent her entire life being defined by the empire, by the expectations of her people. To step away from that was unthinkable, yet the more she thought about it, the more the idea seemed inevitable. You think I have a choice? She snapped. You don't know what it means to be a princess, to be a symbol. The fate of an entire empire rests on my shoulders. You're not a symbol, Dr. Rivers said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were trying to reach something deep within her. You're a person, and people can make choices. Elisara flinched, his words striking a nerve. The weight of his statement hung in the air, thick with a truth that she had spent her life ignoring. The empire wasn't her, at least it didn't have to be. But was she willing to let go of everything she had been taught to value? Before she could respond, the sound of distant engines grew louder, cutting through the tension between them. The enemy ships were closing in faster now. They didn't have time to debate. They had to act. We need to move, Dr. Rivers said, already grabbing the last of the supplies. He extended his hand to her, his eyes serious but not unkind. For a moment, Elisara hesitated, torn between the fear of her empire's wrath and the unknown path that lay ahead. She had always known her duty, her place. But now, she found herself questioning everything. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, she didn't feel the burden of her title. She only felt the weight of her choices. Let's go, she said, her voice steady as she took his hand. They moved quickly, slipping through the underbrush, as the sound of the enemy ships grew louder. Elisara could feel the tension in her muscles, the weight of every step as they navigated the dense forest that surrounded them. Dr. Rivers led the way, seemingly unfazed by the chaos around them, while she followed, unsure of what they were running toward, but knowing they couldn't afford to stay where they were. The ships circled above, their engines roaring as they searched for signs of life. Elisara could feel their presence like a storm on the horizon, ready to descend. Her mind raced. If they were found, it would be over. There would be no escape, no future. She would either be returned to the Empire, or worse, her life would end in disgrace. But Dr. Rivers didn't seem afraid. His steps were measured, his focus unwavering. He had made his choice, and now he was guiding her through the maze of uncertainty. He was her tether, the one person who had never seen her as a symbol, only as someone in need of help. They reached the edge of a cliff, overlooking a deep ravine. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the sound of the ships above them. "We need to climb down," Dr. Rivers said, pointing to a narrow ledge that descended into the darkness below. Elisara's stomach churned as she looked down. It was a dangerous drop, but there was no choice. Either they went down, or they would be caught. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Let's do it." They began their descent, moving quickly but carefully, each step an uncertain gamble. The wind whipped around them, and the sound of the enemy ships grew deafening, as if they were closing in, waiting for the moment to strike. Elisara's fingers scraped against the rough stone, the sharp edge of fear and determination driving her forward. She was no longer just a princess of Trilia. In that moment, she was simply a woman, fighting for her survival. And for the first time, Elisara felt a strange sense of freedom. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Elisara and Dr. Rivers crept deeper into the ravine, their every move carefully calculated. The enemy ships above circled like vultures, their searchlights scanning the ground below, but the darkness was on their side, at least for now. They had to keep moving, keep hiding, but Elisara's heart beat faster with each passing second. They were running out of time. Then, a voice shattered the silence. Well, if it isn't the princess herself." Elisara froze. The voice was unmistakable. She recognized it immediately. "Zara," she muttered, her pulse quickening. The Trillian officer stepped into the clearing, her silhouette framed by the pale light from the ships overhead. Zara was once one of Elisara's closest allies, a trusted friend within the Empire. Or so she had thought. Now she stood before her, eyes cold, expression unreadable. "You," Elisara's voice trembled with a mix of shock and betrayal. "What are you doing here?" Zara's smile was icy, calculating. "I should ask you the same thing. Hiding like a coward, abandoning your empire. How pathetic." Elisara's blood ran cold. Zara wasn't here to rescue her. She wasn't here to help. She was here to deliver her back to the Empire. Or worse. "I don't have time for your games, Zara." "Get out of my way," Elisara snapped, stepping back instinctively. She couldn't afford to be captured. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding a way out. Zara's lips curled into a grin. "You think I'm going to let you escape? You, the princess who betrayed everything she stood for? You're coming with me, Elisara. The Empire wants you back." Elisara's heart sank. She had trusted Zara with her life. Now, Zara was the one standing between her and freedom. The weight of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. There was no room for hesitation. If Zara was working against her, then there was no one she could trust. "I'm not going back," Elisara said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I won't return to that." Before she could finish, Zara raised a hand, silencing her. "You don't have a choice. You're not as important as you think, Elisara. The Empire doesn't need you anymore. They'll make an example of you, and they'll be rid of the disappointment that you've become." Elisara's fists clenched. This was her former friend. This was someone who had once fought by her side. And now she was here, ready to deliver her into the hands of the very empire that had built her, only to cast her aside when she no longer fit their mold. Zara was just a tool, a pawn in the Empire's endless game. Elisara's gaze shifted to Dr. Rivers, who stood beside her, his eyes narrow with understanding. He had already figured out what Zara was. And for a brief moment, the human medic's expression softened, not with fear, but with resolve. "I won't let her take you," Dr. Rivers said quietly, stepping forward. Zara's laughter was short and bitter. "You think you can stop me, human? You're not even armed." "No," Dr. Rivers said calmly, his voice unwavering. "But I don't need to be." With lightning speed, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a beacon, something he had rigged together from their limited resources. He pressed it, and a low hum filled the air. A moment later, the ground shook as a large, shadowy figure emerged from the trees, a massive war mech, one of the hidden human resistance forces that had been tracking them. The mech's heavy footfalls shook the earth as it advanced, its large form blocking Zara's path. Zara's eyes widened, her confidence faltering for the first time. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising in alarm. "This is your backup plan," Dr. Rivers said, stepping aside as the mech's towering silhouette loomed over the clearing. "Now we're leaving." Elisara's heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the realization that everything had changed. She had been betrayed, yes, but for the first time, she saw the possibility of a future outside the Empire. A future where she wasn't bound by duty, by obligation, or by the cruel politics of her people. Zara's hand went to her weapon, but before she could draw it, the mech's massive arms swiped the gun from her grasp with ease, tossing it aside. "You're outmatched, Zara," Dr. Rivers said, his voice steady. "You've lost." Zara's face twisted in fury, but she knew it too. She had lost. And in that moment, Elisara knew she had, too. Her decision to turn her back on the Empire had been final. But the price was steep. The very people she had once trusted, the ones who had stood by her, were now her enemies. "We'll be fine," Dr. Rivers said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. But Elisara knew the truth. They weren't fine. They were just getting started. The dawn broke over the horizon, casting a cold, unforgiving light across the land. Elisara stood at the edge of a cliff, staring out at the vast expanse before her. The wind whipped through her hair, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. The storm was not just outside, it was inside her, tearing at her from every angle. But now, at least for a moment, it felt like the calm before it all. Behind her, Dr. Rivers was busy preparing their last few supplies, packing away what little they had left. But Elisara was too lost in her thoughts to help. The confrontation with Zara had shaken her to her core. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It had shattered the illusions she had about her duty, about her life. What had she been fighting for all these years? Her empire? A bloodthirsty institution that valued power over life? Or herself? Her own freedom? Her choice? "Do you think they'll stop coming after us?" Elisara asked, her voice distant. Dr. Rivers didn't look up from his work. "No. They won't stop until they have you, Elisara. You're too important to them." "I used to think that was true," she said, her voice a mixture of bitterness and disbelief. "But now I'm not so sure." Dr. Rivers paused for a moment, then turned to face her, his expression as steady as ever. "What you are doesn't define what you can become. I told you that you have a choice." Elisara's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, something stirring inside her. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't have to go back to the Empire," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "You don't have to follow the path they've laid out for you." His words, simple and unassuming, struck her like a sudden truth. He was right. She had been born to a destiny, a path carved out by her ancestors and the Empire, but she had never chosen it. It had been forced upon her, shaped by the cruel hands of politics and power. Now, with everything in chaos, she had an opportunity, a chance to forge her own future. "I've been so blinded by what I was supposed to be, I didn't even consider what I could become," she muttered, mostly to herself. The weight of that realization hit her with the force of a crash. She had been living for everyone else's expectations, her empire, her people, her title. And yet, none of it had ever been her own. "You've always had the power to choose," Dr. Rivers said, his voice low but unwavering. "You just had to see it for yourself." She wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that she couldn't just walk away from her legacy. But in her heart, she knew it was true. The Empire might have given her a crown, but it had never given her the freedom to decide for herself. And now, for the first time, Elisara was free. The sound of approaching engines pulled her from her thoughts. The enemy ships were closing in again, their shadow looming over them. "We need to move," Dr. Rivers said, his voice sharp, urgent. "Now." Elisara nodded, her mind racing. She was no longer the princess of Trilia. That title no longer held any weight. She was a fugitive, a renegade, but more importantly, she was alive. And that meant she had a future. They gathered their things quickly and moved toward the dense forest, the sound of the enemy ships growing louder behind them. But Elisara no longer felt the weight of the Empire pressing on her shoulders. Instead, she felt lighter than she had in years, like a heavy burden had been lifted, and the world ahead of her was a wide, open expanse. They ran, their footsteps blending with the rush of wind and the sounds of battle fading into the distance. Elisara didn't know where they were going, didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to follow a map set out by others. She was making her own path now, and whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms.